Hello and welcome back to this week's episode of Closed by Mo. My name is Mohammed. You can call me Mo. I'm hopefully your favorite YouTube host on most things real estate in New York City because I'm a real estate agent and I'm an investor in New York. This week's episode, we're going to talk a little bit more about something that I have kept on repeating to all of my clients that are looking to invest in New York City, especially for first-time investors that are thinking of house hacking. New York City is not a cash flow market. Before I explain any further, let's just jump right into the second part of this video where I actually go into more detail about why that is. Now, before I go into more detail about why I think New York City is just not a cash flow market, I want to make something very clear. There's always exceptions to the rule. So before people start sending me properties saying, hey, this cash flows, you could do this or you could do that. Let me just explain exactly what I mean. The reason why New York City is not a cash flow market is for a couple of different reasons. However, there are still diamonds in the dust, right, where things might cash flow, but you have to understand, you have to make sure that you're squeezing out every single dollar out of those properties in order to make them cash flow. What I mean by that, you better make sure you're renting out the basement. Whether that's illegal or legal for you to do is a whole nother conversation that we can have on the side, but I'm just letting you know what the facts are. Deciding whether or not you want to rent out the basement, renting out the driveway, renting out the garage. I've had landlords that I know that will rent out the backyard space for storage for some of their tenants if they want to store their motorcycles or whatever it is. Yes, you can cash flow in very rare instances. However, you have to make sure that you're squeezing out every single dollar. And this is all assuming you're coming in with a very conventional mortgage amount of like 25% or even lower. Now, the number one reason why New York City is just not a very strong cash flow market, especially in the first couple of years, is that the property prices are just higher. Everything costs more here. It's what we call a HCOL, a high cost of living city. New York City, LA, San Francisco, any other place that you can hear is like super popular in the media, whatever it is a high cost of living city. Even Toronto, for example. In high cost of living cities, the property prices are much higher. So when you try to come in with a conventional mortgage amount and try to rent out the the building or the apartments just to see whether or not you'll cash flow, your mortgage payment and your interest and your taxes amount, whatever amount that is, it's not going to be, the rental amount is just not going to be enough to cover that in the first couple of years. Yes, you can cash flow in probably year 3 to year 4. That's when I start to see my clients, properties start to cash flow, assuming they're raising the rents, periodically every time the lease needs to get renewed. However, in the first couple of years, you're not going to be cash flowing so much just because everything is more expensive, right? At least everyone's feeling the same burn here with everything being expensive. Closing costs are higher, property prices are higher. Everything associated with that transaction is just going to be higher, which leads me to my second point about why it's very difficult to cash flow in New York City. You have higher operating expenses. Like, there's no other way for me to say this. Because everything's more expensive, every little thing that goes into managing the property is also going to be expensive. Contractors are going to cost more, plumbers, electricians, whoever you need to come and repair the property is going to cost more. Property management is also going to cost more. Taxes, insurance, things like that are just going to cost higher because this is a high cost of living city. It's just the name of the game. However, in New York City, there's still very safe investments because of that same demand that drives prices so high, because price appreciation is very stable in markets like New York City. You just know when you buy a property over the next several years, that appreciation is going to happen like clockwork. It's not something you necessarily need to worry about unless there's a huge market crash. But even then, historically, every single time there's been some sort of a market crash, New York City prices rebound higher and better than they have before. It just goes into what your time horizon is before your exit of that particular investment itself. Another point of why New York City is just not really a strong cash flow market. I mean, New York State, let alone New York City, has some of the strongest tenant laws and rent control, rent stabilization laws. I mean, there's about 1 million rent stabilized apartments in New York City, and raising rent on rent stabilized apartments, I don't know if you've ever tried it, is not easy because the rent control board, the rent guidelines board in New York City has to approve every single change the landlord has to make. So with all these units that are rent stabilized, if you were to buy a multifamily property that has a couple of rent stabilized units, you have to understand that you're not going to be able to get as much of a cash flow as you would like from it. Now, if you went into it with the mindset of, hey, I'm going to be buying it for appreciation for the long term, God bless, that is the absolute way to do it. Or you can come in and buy it all cash, and at that point you don't really have a debt service to cover during your cash flow calculations. So technically you'd be cash flow positive, but why would you buy a property with your money and if you could use other people's money, right? The other thing in terms of why there's sort of limited cash flow opportunities in New York City is that it's a very limited value appreciation or value add market, right? Most properties that you're going to purchase, it's not like you can put in $10,000 worth of repairs or anything, and then suddenly the property is going to appreciate by 100,000 or so. That's just not the way it works here. There's very little room for value add, and that's possibly why cap rates a little bit lower commercially, assuming interest rates weren't crazy like they are now, compared to the rest of the market, right? So it's not a place where you can come in and say, hey, you know what, I'm going to buy a value add building and then I'll suddenly be able to cash flow positive. They do exist, obviously, but a lot of times, especially for new investors, if you're going to be purchasing something that's already on the market and it looks like it's a value add, there's just not as much as much margins there as you would, because most of the time the highest margin properties, the highest margin deals are already traded off market. Now, with those key points bearing in mind, you have to understand that New York City is just not a cash flow market. Does that mean that cash flow does not exist? Of course not. Just like any other rule, there are exceptions to the rule, and you will find properties that do cash flow, assuming you squeeze out every single dollar that you can. And I mean quite literally squeeze out, raise the rents, charge rent for driveway use, charge rent for garage use, charge rent for backyard use, maybe even set up separate water meters, whatever it is. So this way the landlord is not responsible for any utilities whatsoever. But those are not super common to come by, and for the most part, New York City is a very difficult market to cash flow unless you're looking at it from between year 3 and year 4. That's typically when you're going to start to cash flow, assuming you keep raising the rents periodically. With that, guys, I hope you really enjoyed this video, because if you're thinking about investing in New York City, especially if you're thinking about house hacking in New York City, I hope you're watching this. And you know what? Anyone that ever asks me about New York City investing and house hacking, I'm just going to send them this video. That's all I'm going to do. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I'll catch you guys next week. Have a good one.